Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the Haydn Symphony Crusade, number 6. And with number 6, we get to the first in the trilogy of symphonies that Haydn wrote to show off his ability to his new patron, Prince Esterházy. Now, Symphonies 6, 7, and 8 are known as the Morning, Noon, and Night Symphonies. And there's a big story behind them. Essentially, what happened was this. Haydn got hired by Esterházy, who was a major guy. I mean, one of the most wealthy and prestigious aristocratic families in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And his first patron, who I believe was Prince Nicholas Esterházy or Prince Paul Esterházy, I don't know, he was an Esterházy. He liked Vivaldi's The Four Seasons. Even then, they were one of classical music's greatest hits. This was in 1761 when Haydn got hired. And the prince challenged Haydn to make his debut with some music that featured the times of day. Hence, the Morning, Noon, and Night Symphonies. Now, Haydn never gave them that title, but they acquired them very quickly afterwards and have had them ever since. And because music with titles always is more popular than music without titles, because people always want to know what music is about, and they would much rather think about it and look at it than actually listen to it. I know that's cynical, but it's also very true. Those titles have stuck, and these are the first sort of popular Haydn symphonies. Now, it's really important, I think, to realize something when we listen to these symphonies. Haydn wrote them in the spring of 1761. Think about this. Handel had only been dead for 2 years. When Haydn started writing symphonies in the late 1750s, Handel was still alive. Bach had been dead for a decade. Can you imagine a greater contrast in styles than between that music and the music of the 5 Haydn symphonies that we listened to just before this one? And now, because the chronology of the early Haydn symphonies is out of whack, we're really going to jump ahead a couple of years. And by 1761, Haydn's style had undergone a sea change in some respects. These are all 4-movement symphonies. They have really special features. Some of those features are dictated by the fact that he had a bigger orchestra to work with, and he was trying to show off the soloists in that orchestra, the individual players of that orchestra. And so he wrote symphonies that have solos for everybody. And I mean everybody. You're not going to believe what's going to happen in these pieces. But when you think about it, it's incredible. They are true concerti for orchestra. We said that already. Even in looking at Symphony No. 5 with its crazy, exciting horn parts, or No. 4 with its creepy, interesting, slow movement. You know, Haydn's symphonies, Haydn's conception of the symphony from the very beginning, people tend to treat it as going from something primitive to something more mature, and then following Beethoven, etc., etc. We are imposing a picture of the symphony that evolved much, much later. Really in the second half of the 19th century, as, the highest form of German music, one of great seriousness, where, there are no special effects and everything is done with the utmost sobriety, even austerity. Haydn had none of that in mind. It wasn't the kind of composer he was. Haydn's view of the symphony was similar to Mahler's, which was that the symphony was the world. It could embrace anything. Haydn's vision was all-encompassing. And I think, especially with regard to these 3 symphonies, with all of their solos, there's a common misconception, in my view, that these solos are based on the Baroque Concerto Grosso, for example, where you have a small sort of concertante group of soloists and then the opposition to the larger orchestra. I mean, they don't do anything like that. They really don't. And they don't sound anything like a concerto grosso, not at all, even though there are those solos there. Those solos are effortlessly integrated into the symphony as a whole. They aren't even symphony concertants, that idea, that hybrid mixture between symphony and concerto, where you have a fixed number of soloists who are soloists throughout. They don't do that either. The way that the solos are used is always dictated by the course of the music, and the integration is absolutely complete. It's part of the totality of Haydn's symphonic vision. He did not say, well, oh gee, I'm going to write a concertante symphony and they're going to be solos no matter what the music sounds like or no matter what it's doing. You will have a violin and a cello and an oboe and they will always be solos. It's not like that. And I don't want you to get that idea. And I read so often in notes about these works that they're half Baroque, half classical. Wrong. They are fully classical. They are modern in the best sense. And they are so modern that, in fact, I don't even think people understand them today in some respects. I really, really don't. Because what Haydn's doing is absolutely characteristic of him. It's a romantic vision, in a sense, of what the symphony can be. Personal and incredibly brilliant. And Paul Esterházy, whoever he was, must have been thrilled when he saw what he'd gotten in hiring his new vice Kapellmeister, because Haydn didn't get the top job right away. He was the associate of, I think, Gregorius Werner was the actual Kapellmeister, but he was crotchety and old and miserable, and so he left all the work to Haydn while he took all the credit, at least until he died, and then Haydn could take over. So I just want to get that out of the way to begin with. So let us start then with the Morning Symphony. And remember, Haydn has two morning symphonies. There's Morning, M-O-R-N-I-N-G, and Mourning, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G. That one will come later. But this one is morning, as in the Morgen in German, morning, part of the day, time of the day. And it begins with a sunrise. The scoring of this symphony is larger than any of the other early symphonies we've heard. It's flute, solo flute, in fact, this case, one flute, two oboes, bassoon, two horns, and the usual strings. And the solos, well, the solos are for everybody. Everybody gets solos. Everybody gets solos. But in this particular symphony, one of the things that adds to its morning-like character is that the main solo goes to the flute. And the flute has a lot to do in 3 of the 4 movements. And we're going to start with the first movement. This is the first Haydn symphony that begins with a slow introduction. And the slow introduction, which is quite brief, it's the world's shortest, but one of the most effective sunrises. And it is so obviously a sunrise that no one has ever had any doubt as to what it's supposed to represent, even though Haydn never said a word about it. Not a word. So let us take a moment and just listen to Haydn's Sunrise. There you go. The sun has come up. This is, by the way, Nicholas Ward, and I think, what is it, the Northern Sinfonia or something like that. Let me see here. I just want to make sure I got this right. Okay, because I'll get yelled at if I make a mistake. All you guys watch me like a hawk. I swear to God, it's so intimidating doing these things. You people are so smart. All right, the Northern Chamber Orchestra under Nicholas Ward on Naxos. So that's what we were listening to, and that was the sunrise. Now, after the sunrise, we get a normal Allegro in sonata form. But, formally, when I say there's no such thing as a standard sonata form with Haydn, there really isn't. I'm going to play you the Exposition. Now, one of the fascinating things about the symphony right off the bat is that the main theme is announced by the flute. The flute leads, and I want you to listen to the scale. The tune is just an arpeggio with a scale that comes up. It's da dum ba da da dum ba ba da dum ba dum. Remember that. It's going to have a tremendous effect much later on in the symphony. And like I said, there are going to be solos for everything in this piece, but I really want you to pay attention not to the formal solos, which they'll come later anyway. The solo violin, the solo cello, the solo viola, the solo double bass, all of this is going to happen. But the fact is, the treatment of the orchestra is soloistic from the very, very beginning. The music is parceled out into small little phrases. It's very continuous, but the colors are constantly changing. Constantly. It's not just, the violins play everything, and every so often someone else plays something in an extended way. What Haydn is doing is a kaleidoscopic phantasmagoria of instrumental color. And that, my friends, is a totally new concept in the history of music. And remember, Handel was only 2 years in the grave when he's doing this. It's so incredible the way, we think of music in terms of periods. And those periods have to be like distinct and separate, but they're not. In reality, they overlap. We know that, for example, that Bach was considered old-fashioned in his day, and he was in a way, because he was carrying certain procedures from the Baroque period to their absolute apex. But while he was doing that, totally different stuff was going on. And you can hear that, for example, if you listen to C.P.E. Bach's music at the same time that you listen to his dad's music. Totally different styles. Totally, totally different. And Haydn is in that world. He's operating on completely new aesthetic ground. And it's just, the year after these symphonies were written, Gluck premiered his Orfeo, the great reform opera that did away with the conventions of Baroque opera Syria. I mean, change was in the air everywhere. So anyway, let's listen to the exposition of the Allegro. There are a couple other things I want to point out when you hear it. The second subject, which I'll indicate, with my usual second subject thing here as it goes, is wonderful. It's wonderful. It features a tiny little phrase played in alternation by all of the winds. Flute, oboe, bassoon, one after the other. And the harmony is really unusual and distinctive. It's impossible to miss. And more than that, what makes it even more interesting is that usually second subjects are moments of relaxation, greater lyricism. In this particular case, it's just the opposite. The lyricism starts at the beginning because it's this flute tune, which is quite pastoral and relaxed. The second subject is even perkier, so the tension actually rises. And I want you to also listen very closely to the very end of the exposition, because it's somewhat open-ended. Haydn usually, in his later works, became very well known for writing endings of expositions that were leaving you in suspense as to what's going to happen next. But he's doing it already in this early symphony. You don't know whether the music's going forward to something else or back to the beginning. It could go either way. And so I'm going to include a little bit of the repeat of the exposition so you can hear just how natural it is that it goes back to the beginning. And then when we hear the development, I'll do the same thing and you can hear how it goes forward. This is all new. It's new because of its coherence, because of its continuity, because of its color. Everything about it is new, and it still sounds it. It still does. I'm telling you. So, here we go, the exposition. You hear what I mean? The use of color, the unbelievable kaleidoscopic variety, the second subject that actually gets perkier and more lively as the music goes on, and then that ending that anything can happen afterwards. It's not just a firm ending with a pause, the way you usually hear it in sonata music. Even like Mozart's, he did that all his life. His sonata expositions tended to end with a nice firm stop before going on. Haydn was always interested in maintaining some sort of continuity and creating suspense and surprise wherever he possibly could. And at these big sectional joins, that's a really important place to try and pull a little musical sleight of hand, So, the development section. Now, the development section follows the exposition very, very closely in sequence. The themes are basically appearing in their normal order. But there are a couple unique features about this development section, too, that are worth noting. First of all, the use of color becomes even more intense. We hear more solos. There's a delicious section of sustained woodwind chords with pizzicato strings underneath. I mean, the use of orchestral color as a guiding principle in its own right is really virtuosic. I'm going to indicate the part with the pizzicato stuff, so you'll pay special attention to it. And then, oh my, then we come to the moment of recapitulation. And the recapitulation is announced by a solo on the horn. So I want you to listen to that. Listen to this right now. Here is the development section leading into the recapitulation, introduced by a solo horn. It's just lovely, poetic, romantic music. Now, where else have we heard a recapitulation introduced by the solo horn? Any guesses? Don't be shy. Well, how about this? Rather later, 40 years later, 45 years later, moment. Check this out. Yes, Beethoven's Eroica, right? It's rather fascinating. I'm not saying that Beethoven was copying Haydn. This is more like one of those great minds think alike moments, as far as I'm concerned, because the main themes are both simple arpeggios, right? Dum, bum, ba, da, dum. And the Beethoven is bum, ba, ba, bum, ba, 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 bum, ba. You know the Beethoven. It's exactly the same idea, concept, and they both sound wonderful on the horn, and a nice soft horn to introduce the recapitulation, and there you have it. So the rest of the movement proceeds as in Haydn's typically rambunctious fashion, and it's beautiful. But also remember the horn. Remember the horn at the recapitulation. That's kind of a cool thing. So that's the first movement. Now, the second movement is no less remarkable. It's scored entirely for strings, and it is, for the most part, a beautiful, beautiful dialogue between violin and cello as solos. However, it also has a very long introduction, a prelude and a postlude. It's an adagio encasing an andante. And the andante is quite charming, and it's a real duet, a very charming little duet. But that opening adagio is so special. I mean, it really is, because I said before, already we know that Haydn was an adagio composer. You know, we talk about the great romantic adagios of Bruckner and Mahler and Beethoven's Ninth. Haydn was the guy who invented that kind of music. He really did. And he's given no credit for it whatsoever. He's supposed to be charming, cute, Papa Haydn, maybe a clown, maybe humorous. Haydn was a deeply spiritual composer. And he wrote throughout his life these adagios that exude this kind of incredible stillness and a rapt silence, rapt, R-A-P-T, not wrapped as in wrapping paper, you know. It's just this beautiful sort of spiritual, elevated emotional plane in his music. And he just gets no credit for it whatsoever. It makes me crazy. But you can hear it so clearly in this particular movement. I want to play you the introduction. Listen to those soft, sustained string chords, the really unusual and I wouldn't call it disturbing, but it has depth, this really mysterious harmony. And then the violin coming in and announcing its presence, and then beginning the duet with the cello in a quicker tempo. It's music like nothing else that had been written up to that time. It's really extraordinary. So here is the first minute and a half or so you'll get a sense of the introduction, and then the duet in the slow movement. Extraordinary music, isn't it? And that introduction, I mean, it sounds like it could have been written yesterday. It's timeless. And that timelessness was one of those remarkable characteristics of Haydn's music at all periods, quite frankly. Now, the third movement is the minuet. And you may recall that in previous symphonies, these earlier symphonies, often the trio section, that is the middle section of the minuet, was an opportunity for Haydn to do interesting things with solo woodwinds. But he's not quite going to do it that way, not the same way here, because in this particular minuet, the trio is quite special. I want to play you the whole minuet, and you'll notice that there's a wind band solo, the whole wind band solo in the second half of the minuet. Now, I'm doing it without repeats, just to save time. I'm playing it straight through with no repeats here or in the trio. But you should know, of course, that in classical minuets of this type, you would hear each half repeated. It would be A, A, B, B. I'm just going to play A, B. So anyway, here is the opening of the minuet. And notice again, because the slow movement had no woodwinds in it at all, that there is an extraordinary emphasis placed on the solo flute, just like in the first movement. And so the timbre of the solo flute is one of the great unifying principles in the symphony. You'll hear it here, and you'll also hear it in the finale. So here is the minuet, straight through. Did you catch the woodwind solo? I mean, I put a little tag there to show you where it was, but that's a wonderful little moment. Now, the trio. Oh, the trio. Haydn's trios. You know, I could talk about every bit of these symphonies. The slow movement, there's so much that's extraordinary. The slow movement is a solo, the trio is a solo for double bass and bassoon, with other people doing other things. And eventually a solo cello, a solo viola. I mean, everyone gets a solo in this. But it's mostly solo double bass and solo bassoon. Now, the fascinating thing about it is not that it's just a solo double bass and a solo bassoon. The fact is, what makes it so wonderful is that Haydn creates a totally unique music for the solo double bass and the solo bassoon. That is an atmosphere and a melody and a texture that is ideally suited to this grotesque combination. And it is a grotesque combination. It's going to be odd, right? I mean, people don't write solo double bass and bassoon things, duets, very often, right? So what Haydn has done isn't just write a duet. You know what another composer would do, because there are double bass solos throughout this period. And what they are is the same as violin solos. And the mood is the same, and the atmosphere is the same. Everything's the same, except it's violin music that's played on a double bass. And a bassoon gets flute music, and it's played on a bassoon. And it sounds ridiculous. One of the reasons that music sounds so shallow and unconvincing is that it's not really taking advantage of the peculiar timbral qualities of the instruments that are being written for. You know, the virtuosi of the day were very desperate to show that their instrument could do everything you could do on a more normal instrument. And so they wrote that way. Haydn does not. Haydn writes special music for special instruments. So listen to this trio. You will not have heard anything like it in your life. It is absolutely, totally unique to this combination of instruments, and you cannot imagine it performed on any other combination of instruments. And that's what makes it so special. That's its genius. So here you go. Here's the trio. You see what I mean? I mean, you couldn't play that on a flute and a violin. You couldn't play it on anything else. It's real double bass music. It's with this doleful minor key tune on top of it, in the bassoon, and then the repeat. It's wonderful. It's just it's so extraordinarily individual. And like I said, Haydn's conception of the symphony was Mahlerian. It encompasses the world. He was able to create new music to put into his symphonies and just effortlessly absorb influences and ideas from everywhere, from everyday life, from the timbre of the instruments, whatever the concept of mourning. It doesn't matter. It all becomes a beautifully integrated, coherent whole. And speaking of coherence, now we get to the finale. Now the finale, remember I told you to remember that little uprushing theme from the first movement? Remember that? And the flute? Well, what do you think the finale starts with? When you hear the finale, you know that it belongs to this symphony because you recognize it. You recognize the concept. I am going to play you the opening of the symphony and then the opening of the finale. I put a little, half a second pause between them so that you can hear one right after the other. Just take a listen to this for a second. I don't even need to put this thing up. You can stare at me while you listen to this. See what I mean? Can you tell that you hear the relationship? I mean, obviously you hear the relationship. The timbre is the flute in both cases. There's that upward rushing scale in both cases. And this is what Haydn's doing. So all that remains now is to listen to the exposition of the finale, because the finale brings home everybody. The whole crowd comes back for the picnic. That's what's going on. And they all get their little solos. It's as a combination of the soloistic string writing in the second movement with the woodwind solos in everywhere else. And everybody comes back and does a solo. Let's listen now to the exposition. You see? You hear everybody having a great time right there? It's amazing. Everybody's back and they're all doing their little solo thing, but it's all wonderfully breezy and well integrated into the flow of the music as a whole. But even more interesting, as if it were possible, remember I said, remember the horns? The horns in the recapitulation in the first movement? Haydn does the same thing in the finale. Although in the first movement, the horn introduced the recapitulation. In the finale, the recapitulation introduces the horns. But they get their lick, their solo lick, because Haydn is using these timbral cues to bind the symphony together, to keep everything coherent and linked and wonderfully fresh, but nothing is repeated literally. Nothing is melodically repeated literally. It's always a question of using your memory of sound, of certain specific sounds in certain specific places. And in that way, he energizes and gives life to the actual symphonic form. I mean, the form is not just something that you impose from without or think of some sort of, I have to write in sonata form. It's not. It's the inevitable outcome of the way that he's using the instruments and the melodies that he gives them and the keys that he's adopting. And by having these things relate to each other, you begin to realize the purposefulness of Haydn's handling of form. So I've also done a little combination of the moment of recapitulation in both the first movement and last movement. And listen to that too. Here it is. You see what I mean? The prominence of the horns. These are the little things that mark quality work from junk, if you know what I mean. I mean, that shows you that Haydn was paying attention. He was paying attention to every single detail of what happens to this music and every single formal detail. I mean, it's mind-blowing how fabulous this stuff is. But that, my friends, was Haydn's Morning Symphony. Next will be noon, and finally will be evening. And then we have to jump back a couple of years to that first pile of symphonies that Haydn did in his earliest days. But they're no less remarkable, as I think we already know. But, oh my God, what a new world has just opened up with the premiere in 1761 for Prince Esterházy of Haydn's Morning Symphony. And how appropriate it is that it's morning. It's the dawn of a new age. And that's what this symphony represents. Of course, every symphony represents the dawn of a new age, I guess, but this is really the dawn of a new age. So keep on listening, folks. Thank you for joining me in this episode of the Haydn Symphony Crusade. Take care.